The bells of St. Halomir tolled through the drizzle, like a slow judgment upon the living. Each peal shuddered through the great cathedral's ribs, through the candle smoke that curled like sighs above a congregation dressed in pearls and suspicion. Beneath the archway, Lady Evelyn Harcourt stood as still as a marble effigy, her hands bound in lace and trembling silence. Rain tapped against the stained glass saints, as if heaven itself could not bear to watch. She had been promised to the Duke of Ashbourne since birth, a pact whispered in ink and sealed before she could form a word. Today that promise stood dressed in ivory and expectation. Yet the Duke had not come. The organist's fingers lingered on uncertain chords, and a murmur rippled through the pews. Ladies adjusting their fans, gentlemen whispering wagers beneath the thrum of incense. The air smelled of roses wilting too soon. Her father, Lord Harcourt, stood rigid at her side, a portrait of ruined pride. "He will arrive," he muttered, though his voice carried the tone of a gambler reciting a prayer. Evelyn did not answer. She watched the door with an expression carved from endurance, her heart a quiet drum beneath corseted silk. Every eye in London was upon her, its gossiping matrons, its velvet-clad debutantes, its young men already scripting her tragedy for the evening papers. At last, the doors groaned open. The Duke of Ashbourne entered with the measured grace of a man inspecting his own portrait. His coat, black as confession, clung immaculate to his tall frame. His cravat gleamed like a blade. There was no apology in his eyes, only calculation. He bowed faintly to the priest, not to his bride, and took his place as though duty itself were an inconvenience. The whispers subsided into breathless curiosity. Evelyn's pulse slowed to a single note of resignation. She had loved him once in theory, the way girls love constellations, distant, unreachable, and cold. Now that star had descended to earth only to scorch her. She turned her face toward the altar, unwilling to give gossip the satisfaction of her tears. The priest began to speak of vows and virtue, his voice echoing through a silence thick with candlelight. Then the wind rose. A sound of hooves thundered beyond the cathedral gates. Doors once again burst open, flinging rain and rumor into the sacred air. Gasps scattered like startled birds. A man stood framed in the storm, dark hair soaked to his collar, cloak torn, eyes burning with a defiance that made the chandeliers tremble. It was Gabriel Thorne, the Duke of Blackthorn. His name was spoken in salons as curse and legend, a man who had vanished after a duel, rumored dead, rumored mad. Now he stood alive and uninvited at her wedding. His voice, low and edged with thunder, carried across the marble floor. "She was promised to me first." The sentence fell like a sword. The congregation erupted, fans snapping shut, gentlemen rising, the priest faltering mid-prayer. Evelyn's breath caught. The years folded upon themselves, revealing a memory, a sun-drenched garden, two children exchanging a locket, the boy's vow, "When the world forgets you, I shall remember." She had not heard that voice in a decade, yet her soul recognized it before her mind dared believe. Ashbourne's composure fractured for the first time. "This is absurd," he hissed. "Remove him." His hand twitched toward his cane, not out of fear, but outrage at impropriety. Guards hesitated, glancing toward Lord Harcourt, who seemed carved from ash. The priest whispered a prayer for deliverance that no one heard. Gabriel stepped forward, rain dripping from his cuffs, leaving dark footprints on holy ground. "I come not to steal," he said quietly, "but to reclaim what was taken under false promise." His gaze fixed on Evelyn, not pleading, not accusing, simply remembering. "Ask her," he said to the assembly, voice soft but lethal, "and she will tell you the truth." All color fled from the bride's cheeks. 100 eyes turned upon her, demanding explanation, spectacle, repentance. She felt their hunger, the thrill of scandal, the sweet scent of downfall. Her father whispered, "Deny him." Ashbourne's glare commanded the same. Yet in that breath between choices, Evelyn felt something ancient stir, the unbearable weight of honesty. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The bells outside began again, this time without rhythm, clanging over the rain like the pulse of fate. In that discordant music, she saw the lives expected of her, a loveless marriage gilded with ceremony, a lifetime of elegant silence. And she saw, too, the man who had come drenched in ruin to keep an old promise. "Lady Harcourt," Ashbourne said through clenched teeth, "this farce ends now. You owe it to your name." His fingers tightened around her gloved hand until the bones protested. For the first time, she met his gaze, not as a dutiful bride, but as a woman awakening. "My name," she whispered, "was never yours to command." Gasps again, delicate, horrified, intoxicating. She withdrew her hand. The lace tore slightly, a whisper of rebellion. The organ fell silent. Even the candles seemed to lean toward her. Blackthorn's expression did not change, yet something in his eyes gentled, a flicker of grief or gratitude. He bowed once, a gesture of both apology and claim, and turned toward the door. No one stopped him. The rain swallowed his figure, his cloak vanishing into the gray beyond the threshold. The Duke of Ashbourne stood frozen, his pride bleeding invisibly. Lord Harcourt reached for his daughter, but she stepped back. "I have brought shame enough upon this house," she said softly. "Let me bear it alone." Her words, spoken with quiet clarity, carried farther than any scream. When the crowd finally dispersed, leaving trails of gossip like smoke, Evelyn remained before the altar. The priest, uncertain whether to bless or condemn, simply lowered his eyes. The candles guttered one by one, surrendering to the damp air. She looked up at the great stained glass above, St. Catherine holding her broken wheel, and thought how even saints were remembered for the manner of their suffering. Outside, the carriage wheels splashed through puddles, carrying guests eager to feast upon ruin. Inside, the echo of Blackthorn's words lingered. "Ask her, and she will tell you the truth." The truth, such a simple thing, yet heavier than any crown. Evelyn lifted her veil and let it fall to the floor. The pearls sewn along its edge scattered like small moons upon the stone. For the first time, she breathed without trembling. The rain had turned to steady rhythm, washing away the incense, the perfume, the false promises. She stepped toward the great doors, alone now, her gown whispering across the marble. Beyond the threshold, the storm waited like an accomplice. Somewhere within that endless gray, a carriage wheel turned, and perhaps a man looked back only once before vanishing into legend. The wind caught the last candle and snuffed it out. In the darkness that followed, the city's bells tolled again, not in celebration, but as if marking the birth of a scandal that would haunt every drawing room by nightfall. Yet within that shame lay a strange, trembling freedom. For the first time in her life, Lady Evelyn Harcourt had not obeyed. And far down the rain-slick street, where no one could see, a gloved hand held half a locket gleaming beneath the gaslight, waiting for its match to remember. The scandal ripened like fruit left too long in the sun. London was merciless in its appetite. Whisper by whisper, Lady Evelyn Harcourt's name traveled from the drawing rooms of Mayfair to the tea tables of Bath. The jilted Duchess, they called her, though no one could decide which duke had done the jilting. The Times printed anonymized verses about a bride of two vows, and caricaturists filled the shop windows with ink mockery. A woman between two gentlemen, each holding one half of her heart as though it were a spoiled inheritance. By the third week, the Harcourt estate had drawn its curtains like a wounded creature retreating underground. Servants moved as ghosts. Letters arrived by the basket and left unopened. Evelyn spent her days in the east parlor, where the light fell thin and gray through the damask drapes. Her father rarely spoke to her now. His disappointment was a presence heavier than furniture. He poured himself into ledgers and port, and when he did address her, his words came like edicts. "Your only salvation, Evelyn, is to wed Ashbourne without delay. Scandal must be buried beneath ceremony." She nodded politely, but the gesture was hollow. She had already buried something far greater, her faith in the sanctity of duty. That evening, a parcel arrived bearing no seal. A small velvet box, its edges frayed as if carried across miles of storm. Inside lay a half-locket, its hinge broken, its surface engraved with the blackthorn crest, a thorn entwined around a rose. Within it, a scrap of paper, trembling as she unfolded it. "For when the world forgets." She remembered then, the summer of her 14th year, when the air smelled of honeysuckle and rain. Her family had visited the Blackthorn estate. Gabriel had been 16, reckless and kind in equal measure. He had taught her to ride bareback across the clover fields, laughing at her fear of speed. When he departed for the academy, he pressed that locket into her palm and said, "When you grow to be a duchess, you must remember how to breathe the open air." She had worn it until the day her father forbade mention of his name. Now 10 years later, its return felt like a summons from a life she had once believed imagined. London refused to let her vanish quietly. Ladies in silk came under the guise of sympathy, their eyes bright with curiosity. Men spoke of her beauty as one might speak of a ruin, still graceful, yet fallen. And so, when the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne arrived one wet afternoon, Evelyn rose to greet her with the stoic politeness of a penitent child. "My dear," the Dowager began, her voice a silken razor, "society has a short memory for virtue and an eternal one for scandal. You will marry my son this month or be buried alive in rumor. He is willing to forgive your moment of weakness. You must be grateful." Evelyn smiled faintly. Forgiveness is a grace bestowed by God, not by men who arrive late to their own weddings. The Dowager's eyes narrowed like drawn needles. She rose, her perfume lingering like a threat. When the door closed, Evelyn pressed her palm against the window pane and watched the carriage roll away, its wheels splashing through the mud that bore her family's crest. She understood then that pity was a more polished form of cruelty. Her father summoned her that night. He stood before the fireplace, letters scattered like confetti of ruin. "Do you think love excuses dishonor?" he demanded. "Do you believe you may choose your own path like a common girl?" His voice cracked beneath its rage. "You will wed Ashbourne and salvage what remains of us." Evelyn looked into the flames. "I do not seek salvation in his name, nor yours." For a moment, Lord Harcourt seemed to see her not as a daughter, but as a mirror of his own failures. He turned away, muttering about bonds and debts and the price of a title. When she left him, his shadow trembled against the wall like that of a broken king. That same week, the Harcourts were invited to the Duchess of Langmere's masked ball, a charity gala intended to welcome Lady Evelyn back to society. Her father insisted she attend. He believed visibility would mend reputation. Evelyn knew it was a parade of curiosity disguised as mercy, but she obeyed out of something stranger than duty, hope that perhaps humiliation had an end. The Langmere mansion was a cathedral of light. Hundreds of candles dripped onto mirrors and crystal until the entire ballroom seemed made of liquid gold. Masks glittered, laughter echoed, and the music swelled with the kind of joy that makes sorrow unbearable. Evelyn arrived in a gown of dusky blue, her mask a simple silk half-veil meant to hide nothing. People stared all the same. She moved through the crowd like a ghost in her own story, every whisper a thread in the web that held her. When the orchestra shifted to a waltz, a figure in black appeared beside her. He wore no mask, only the shadow of one, the kind that follows a man who has lived too long with his sins. "Would you grant me this dance?" he asked, offering a gloved hand. His voice was low, measured, yet something in its depth struck through her like music half remembered. "Sir," she replied, striving for indifference, "you are unknown to me." "Are you certain?" He stepped closer, and she saw the faint scar at his temple, the same one she had bandaged as a girl when a wild mare had thrown him. Memory stole her breath. The room fell away. He bowed, not mocking, but solemn. Some promises do not wither with years. Her heart beat like wings against its cage. She placed her hand in his. The music caught them in its tide. Silk brushed velvet, gloves whispered over sleeves. Around them, the world continued its charmed decay. For a moment, it was only the two of them and the ghost of their past. When the final note fell, he bent his head and said, so softly that no one else could hear, "Tomorrow at midnight. The Ashbourne Terrace. Truth should not live in shadows." Before she could answer, he was gone, absorbed by the crowd like a dream at dawn. Later, in the carriage home, Evelyn held the half-locket beneath her glove, its metal warm against her skin. Her father spoke of appearances and alliances, but his voice was a distant drum. Outside, fog blurred the city into a phantom of gold and coal. She closed her eyes and saw Gabriel's face not as a ghost, but as a question. What if love, for once, was not the enemy of honor, but its truest form? When they reached the estate, a servant waited with a sealed envelope. The wax bore the blackthorn crest, and the handwriting was his, firm, uncompromising. Her father snatched it first, sneering. Another appeal from that disgraced boy. He shall not have you. He threw it into the fire without reading. Flames devoured the parchment, and a curl of smoke rose like the sigh of fate itself. But Evelyn had already memorized the hour he had spoken. Midnight. On the terrace. A meeting not of courting, but reckoning. She stood by the window long after her father retired, watching the embers die. Outside, the rain returned, soft and restless, like a heart that cannot decide whether to forgive or to forget. Somewhere beyond that veil of weather, Gabriel waited, and with him the truth that could either redeem her name or end it forever. The clock struck 11. 1 hour until midnight. She did not yet know whether she was walking toward salvation or scandal, but for the first time in months, she felt alive enough to risk both. Midnight unfurled across the gardens like spilled ink, swallowing every hedge and statue in a hush too perfect to be trusted. The terraces of Ashbourne Manor gleamed faintly under the silver wash of moonlight, their marble balustrades damp with mist. Lady Evelyn Harcourt stepped through the open French doors, the hem of her cloak brushing dew from a stone. Behind her, the ballroom murmured with laughter and stringed music, polite society unaware that its fallen duchess had slipped into scandal once more. Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from a terrible anticipation that always attends a moment before truth. She had not sent word, had not dared to answer his note. Yet he was there. Gabriel Thorne stood by the far edge of the terrace, one hand on the railing, the other bare to the night air. The moon outlined him in pale resolve, tracing the hard planes of his face, the quiet grief behind his stillness. "You came," he said softly, as though her arrival were both miracle and accusation. "I told myself I would not," she replied, voice scarcely above a whisper. "But I have grown tired of obeying myself." He smiled then, a shadow of the boy she had once known. "I remember when you said the same about your governess and lessons. And you remember too much." The silence that followed was not empty. It brimmed with the years they had lost, letters unsent, dreams unspoken, and the echo of the day his name became forbidden in her house. Wind stirred her cloak, carrying the faint scent of roses and gunpowder, the strange perfume of memory and danger intertwined. Gabriel's gaze lingered on her face. "You have changed," he murmured. "So have you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I have only become what my father feared, a man who cannot forget." The words hung between them like confession. Evelyn turned away toward the garden, where fountains whispered secrets to no one. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "London will not forgive what you did." "London forgives no one until it is fashionable to do so," he said quietly. "I came because the papers announced your marriage. Because the man who nearly killed me for daring to love you would now call you his wife." Her throat tightened. "You should not have come here. If you challenge him again—" "Then I will finish what was denied me," he interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp with a passion half fury, half devotion. He lied. "His father destroyed my family to ensure this match. They called it honor, but it was theft." Evelyn faced him, her composure trembling at the edges. "And what would you have of me, Gabriel? To flee with you? To crown this ruin with another scandal?" He stepped closer. The moon caught in his eyes, gray as winter light. "I would have you remember," he said simply. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. He reached into his coat and drew out the other half of the locket, theirs long ago severed. The hinge had been mended, the silver polished, but a faint crack ran through its center like the memory of pain. "It survived exile," he said. "So did I." Evelyn's gloved hand lifted, almost unwillingly, until her fingers brushed the cold metal. The contact was electric, past and present colliding in the small space between them. She wanted to step back, to speak reason, but reason felt small in the presence of a man who had once bled for her name. "Do you believe," she asked softly, "that one gesture can mend 10 years of silence?" "No," he answered, "but I believe it can begin." She withdrew her hand, trembling. "And what a duty! My father's debts? My family's ruin? Love is not a solvent strong enough to wash away disgrace." He smiled faintly, though pain lived beneath it. "You speak as though love were a sermon you've already outgrown." "Because it is," she said too quickly. "Because I cannot afford its comfort." He regarded her with a tenderness that undid her defenses. "You were never meant for comfort, Evelyn. You were meant for courage." She looked away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. Beneath them, the fountains gleamed, scattering silver into the air like blessings that never landed. The orchestra within the manor swelled, the notes drifting through the open doors, waltz, laughter, lies. He took a step nearer. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "Marry him, and the world will call you honorable. Refuse, and it will call you lost. But if you stay silent, if you let them decide what becomes of you, you will no longer belong to yourself." Her heart hammered with the cruel clarity of it. For all his defiance, Gabriel spoke the one truth she had avoided. Silence was its own kind of death. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Why not leave me my ruin in peace?" "Because peace is not what I owe you," he said. "Truth is." She met his eyes, steady now. "Then tell me the whole of it." He hesitated, and for the first time she saw fear in him. "Ashbourne's father forced the duel," he said. "He bribed the magistrate to condemn me, threatened my mother's estate to ensure my exile. When I returned this month, it was not forgiveness I sought, it was justice." The word struck her like the toll of a distant bell. "Justice," she repeated, the syllables tasting of both salvation and peril. "You mean to duel him again?" "I mean to end what was begun in deceit. Gabriel, if you do this, then I live as myself, or not at all." She turned from him, pressing her hand to the cold stone rail. Below, the garden swayed in the wind like a dark sea. "They will call it murder," she whispered. "Perhaps," he said, "but you know the truth of what he did." Her silence was answer enough. He reached forward, his gloved hand brushing her sleeve, an apology, a vow, an impossible farewell. "When the sun rises," he said, "the matter will be settled. You need not come." Her voice broke on the words. "And if you fall?" "Then I will have fallen doing what honor refused to do." She turned toward him, but he was already retreating into shadow. His footsteps were almost silent against the marble. When he reached the threshold, he looked back once more. "If you see the dawn, Evelyn," he murmured, "remember that I saw it too, once in your eyes." Then he was gone. She stood alone beneath the moon, every nerve alive with dread. The fountains whispered. A single rose petal drifted from the balustrade, dark and wet as blood. Behind her, the ballroom continued its dance, the world spinning oblivious to the ruin about to unfold at sunrise. A servant's voice carried faintly from the doorway, calling her name, but she did not turn. Her hand closed around the locket, still warm from his touch. She opened it. The halves met perfectly, the crack between them glinting like a scar that refused to heal. A new sound came then, the distant clatter of hooves beyond the gardens, swift and purposeful, heading toward Richmond Fields. The hour was near. She knew what it meant, though she wished she did not. As she watched the last echo vanish into the dark, she felt the first pale thread of dawn on the horizon, a warning stitched in light. Dawn came slowly, the kind that does not break but bleeds. Gray light seeping through the mist until the fields of Richmond looked like ghosts of themselves. The frost clung to every blade of grass, and the air carried that solemn stillness known only to places that have yet to witness violence. Beneath a stand of bare oaks, two men stood facing one another, their silhouettes sharp against the pale horizon. Between them lay 10 measured paces, and a destiny neither could escape. Evelyn's mare stumbled on the frost as she rode through the fog, her cloak heavy with dew. She had fled her father's house before the servants stirred, leaving only a note on her vanity: "Do not come after me." The letter from Gabriel, burned by her father, had already been rewritten in her heart. She knew what waited beyond the hedgerows, yet she could not remain behind curtains while honor demanded blood. Every hoofbeat echoed against her ribs. Each gust of wind whispered that she was already too late. The dueling ground revealed itself in fragments. First the oak branches, then the pistols glinting in the dawn. Lord Ashbourne stood rigid in his riding coat, every inch the picture of aristocratic control. Gabriel Thorne, cloaked in black, looked carved from the same cold marble as the field itself. They did not speak. Only the appointed seconds, two silent men with faces stiffened by protocol, moved to measure the distance. The world felt suspended, waiting for a spark. From the ridge, Evelyn saw the glint of steel and froze. Her breath caught like a thread between worlds. For a moment she could not move. Then instinct, something deeper than decorum, took her. She dismounted, the hem of her gown trailing through the frost, and ran. Her boots struck the earth in muted rhythm with her racing pulse. She reached the clearing just as one of the seconds raised his hand. "Stop." Her voice shattered the quiet. The men turned, astonishment written in their stillness. The fog coiled around her as she stepped between them, hair undone, face pale against the cold. The world had conspired to make her a scandal. Now she made herself one willingly. Ashbourne's voice came first, clipped and furious. "Lady Evelyn, you disgrace yourself." "I have been disgraced already," she said, her voice calm though her chest heaved. "There is little left to lose." Gabriel's eyes widened with horror. "You should not be here." "Then end this before it ends you," she whispered. Ashbourne's gaze flicked between them, her trembling hand resting near Gabriel's sleeve, the unmistakable intimacy of understanding. Something inside him cracked, pride, jealousy, perhaps the illusion of control. "So it is true," he said coldly. "You were his before you were mine." "I was never anyone's," she replied. "That is the truth you both refuse to see." The wind pressed against them, carrying the distant cry of a hunting hawk. The seconds looked uncertain, waiting for command. Gabriel lowered his pistol. "This is over," he said quietly. "No woman should bleed for the vanity of men." Ashbourne's eyes burned. "You think to humiliate me with mercy?" He lifted his weapon, but Evelyn stepped forward, blocking his aim. "If one of you must die for honor," she said, her tone steady though her heart hammered, "let it be my name that falls instead." For a moment, no one breathed. Frost melted in tiny rivers along her boots. Her hair, loosened by wind, brushed the pistol's barrel. Ashbourne's expression faltered. Perhaps he saw not defiance, but a reflection of the life he had never deserved. Slowly his arm dropped. "Enough," Gabriel said. "The debt was never yours to pay, Evelyn. It was mine." He threw his pistol aside. It landed in the grass with a muffled thud. "If honor requires my ruin, then so be it." Ashbourne's jaw tightened. "You would rather die than kneel?" Gabriel's smile was a wound. "I have done both." A silence heavier than gunpowder filled the air. Then, to everyone's shock, Ashbourne turned away. His pride, that brittle weapon, had broken beneath the weight of what he saw, a woman willing to face a bullet, and a man who refused to return one. He spoke without looking back. "Take her, then. Let the city devour you both." He mounted his horse and vanished into the mist. The echo of hooves lingered long after he was gone. Evelyn stood motionless, unable to trust what had just unfolded. The frost beneath her began to thaw, turning to wet earth beneath her slippers. Gabriel approached carefully, as though afraid she might vanish if touched. "You should have stayed away," he murmured. "And live with myself?" she asked. "No. I have lived in silence long enough." He laughed, but the sound trembled like something newly born. "Then you've won the only duel that mattered." She shook her head. "No one wins against society. They will call this madness." "They already have," he said softly. "But perhaps madness is the last refuge of the truthful." A faint smile ghosted across her lips, then faded. "What will you do now?" "I will leave England," he said. "There is no home left for me here." "Not unless—" he stopped, unwilling to trap her with unfinished hope. Evelyn glanced toward the horizon, where the fog thinned to a ribbon of pink light. "And if I followed?" "You would lose everything," he said. She exhaled, her breath clouding in the dawn. Then perhaps everything is not worth as much as we were told. The words hung there, dangerous and tender. He reached for her hand, just for a moment, just enough to feel the pulse beneath her glove. When they speak of you, he whispered, they will call you ruined. But I will call you brave. Bravery, she said, looking toward the place where Ashbourne had vanished, feels very much like fear that refuses to stop walking. He smiled, tired, reverent. Then walk with me. She hesitated, torn between the weight of duty and the pull of a life she could almost see beyond the mist. Behind them, one of the seconds cleared his throat, reminding them of the watching world. Gabriel released her hand and bent to retrieve the discarded pistol. He unloaded it, the empty chamber clicking softly. A final defiance against the morning's hunger for blood. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice barely audible. If I go home, they will marry me off within the week. And if you don't, she looked at him fully now. Then I must find a new definition of home. He studied her face, the quiet courage there, the exhaustion, the strange peace of a woman who had finally chosen her own ruin. The first light broke through the trees, spilling gold across her hair. It made her look less like a scandal and more like a promise. The silence between them deepened, tender and uncertain. Then Gabriel spoke, so low she almost missed it. What will become of us now that truth is known? Evelyn turned toward the sunrise, her answer still forming in her heart. The frost cracked beneath their feet as the world awakened around them. She did not speak, for some truths could not yet survive daylight. And somewhere behind the mist, London began to stir, ready to feast upon the ruin of the morning. The sea was gray that morning, restless beneath a pewter sky. Gulls wheeled in the salt wind, crying over the cliffs of Northumberland, where waves crashed like the pulse of something half alive, half remembering. Lady Evelyn Harcourt, no longer of Harcourt, no longer of anywhere, walked the rugged path above the tide with her cloak drawn close, her hands roughened by work that once would have scandalized her world. A year had passed since the duel, a year since she had watched two men and an empire of manners collapse beneath a single act of mercy. London had buried her name in whispers, and she had not mourned its funeral. The cottage she had chosen overlooked the sea. It was small but honest, stone hearth, single window, a garden perpetually bullied by wind. Here, no one called her Duchess. The fishermen greeted her with nods, the widows with quiet respect born of shared solitude. She had learned to keep bees, to mend nets, to bake bread that did not taste of grief. Yet even in this plain life, the world had not unmade her entirely. She still carried herself with the posture of someone raised among chandeliers. It clung to her like the faint scent of lilac that even hard work could not erase. Each evening, she walked the cliffs until dusk turned the sea to ink. And every night, before she blew out the lamp, she opened a small wooden box and looked at the mended locket within. It had once represented two children's promise, then a scandal, then a death sentence. Now it was simply proof that some memories refused to die quietly. On that particular morning, the tide was higher than usual, flinging white spray against the rocks. She paused, watching the horizon blur. A shape emerged far off, a carriage, dark against the pale road winding toward the coast. Her heart gave one startled beat, then another. She told herself it was nothing, another traveler lost on the moor, yet her pulse betrayed her. Few sought this lonely stretch of land, and fewer still carried themselves with such purpose. By noon, the carriage had stopped at her gate. The driver waited, silent as a sentinel. From within stepped a man in a long coat, his hair touched with sea spray and distance. He removed his hat, hesitated, then smiled, hesitant, human. The wind caught the edge of his coat and revealed a glint at his throat, the broken chain of a locket, familiar as breath. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her shawl. "Gabriel," she whispered, as though saying the name might conjure or destroy him. He bowed, though his eyes did not leave hers. "Forgive the intrusion. I had to see with my own eyes that you still existed." "London told you I was dead?" "Worse," he said. "They told me you had forgiven them." The sound she made was not quite laughter. Forgiveness is a luxury for those who still attend parties. He stepped closer, cautious, as if one wrong word might send her vanishing into mist. I was pardoned, he said at last. The Queen's ministers reviewed the case. Ashbourne's father's dealings came to light. My name has been restored, though I no longer recognize what it means. Evelyn looked past him, toward the restless horizon. Restoration is a fine word for things that cannot be mended. Gabriel's gaze softened. Perhaps not mended, but remembered rightly. The sea boomed beneath them, vast and indifferent. He reached into his coat and drew out something small and silver. It was the other half of the locket, cleaned, polished, its hinge repaired so precisely it gleamed where once it had been cracked. He offered it without flourish. I kept it through exile. I thought I might return it, someday, if the world became kind. And has it? He smiled faintly. No, but I have. She took the locket, the weight of it warming in her palm. What is it you want of me, Gabriel? He considered. To know if the life we destroyed was worth the truth we found. Her answer came after a long silence. Truth never spares what it saves. He looked at her as if she were both wound and cure. And yet you chose it still. I had to, she said. A lie can keep you alive, but it cannot keep you human. He exhaled, the sound almost a laugh. Then perhaps I've been human all along. The wind rose, whipping her hair across her face. He reached out without thinking, brushing the strands back with a gesture so intimate it broke the distance of a year. She did not move away. They will talk again if I return with you, she said quietly. The Duchess who ran to ruin. They already talk, he murmured. Let them learn the vocabulary of redemption. She studied him. The lines newly etched at his eyes, the roughened hands, the humility that had replaced his recklessness. He looked older, yes, but also anchored in a way that made her heart ache. You have changed, she said. So have you. And what are we now? Two souls who outlived their reputations. The simplicity of it disarmed her. For the first time, she smiled without defense. You came all this way to give me back a trinket. To ask for more, he said. To ask if a woman who defied a kingdom might still believe in beginnings. The sea, wind pressed between them like a witness. She glanced down at the locket, then back at him. Beginnings, she repeated softly. They require faith. Then let me be the fool who believes first. He extended his hand, palm open, neither commanding nor pleading. She looked at it for a long moment, as though measuring the cost of tenderness. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The gesture felt less like surrender than recognition. Around them, the waves crashed in applause. By evening, the sky cleared. They walked together down the slope toward the chapel that overlooked the cliffs, a small place of white stone, its bells silent for years. Inside, candles flickered against worn pews and weathered icons. The air smelled of salt and sanctity. An old priest, startled but kind, agreed to bless their union privately. There were no guests, no orchestra, no dowry. Only two people and the sound of the sea promising eternity just beyond the walls. When Gabriel slipped the ring onto her finger, plain gold, no crest, no lineage, Evelyn felt the weight of centuries lift. He whispered, no witnesses but the wind, and she answered, it has always known our names. Outside, dusk gathered into indigo. He kissed her beneath the chapel arch, not with possession, but with reverence, as though sealing a covenant older than bloodlines. Somewhere far away, London's lamps were being lit, each one burning to forget them. But on this coast, the only light that mattered came from the stars beginning to pierce the sky. Later, as they stood at the cliff's edge, Evelyn closed the locket around both halves joined at last. Its clasp clicked softly, like the closing of a story too fragile for noise. She turned it in her hand and smiled. So the world ends here, she said. No, Gabriel replied. It begins here quietly, as all truthful things do. The wind carried her laughter out over the sea, mingling with the rhythm of the waves. And though the city would never speak her name again, every rose that bloomed along the Blackthorn coast would bear her scent, the fragrance of a love that chose truth over title, and began where shame had once ended.